Hello and welcome to the first in a series of educational videos put on in association with Samek Music. My name's Chris Jollett and I'm the creative consultant in education for Samek Music. What we're going to be looking at in this first video is scales. And we're going to split this into 5 different sections. The first 3 are going to focus on a single scale. So we're going to look at where to start and how far to go with that scale, mixing up with different articulations, and how to use a metronome when practicing your scales. The 4th and 5th area of this video, we're going to look at ways that we can connect different scales together. So we're going to look at the circle of fifths and how we can use that as a tool in our practice session. We're also going to look at the major and minor link, specifically focusing on the major and minor pentatonic. So the first thing I want to mention is you don't need to know all of your scales to implement some of these ideas into your practice session. I'm going to use C major as a base for all of these musical examples I'm going to show you. I'm going to flash some music up on the screen as well to hopefully guide you into what I'm actually playing. So to start with, we're going to just play our C major scale over 1 octave. Next thing that we might do is stretch that over 2 octaves. Now, where I suggest you go next is a really important step. More often than not, we see the top part of our instrument and the bottom part of our instrument as the most difficult to play. What I'm saying is that it's just the most unfamiliar to us. If you think about playing your scales, most of our scales we might play over 1 or 2 octaves. We need to stretch where we're playing our scales. So if we play them full range, so what we're saying there is we play the scale right to the top of the instrument and right down to the bottom of the instrument, we're then covering the whole range of the instrument in every single scale we play. So every single scale on the saxophone is going up to a top F or F sharp and down to a bottom B or a bottom B flat. Now let me give you that example using C major. So I'm going to play it over 2 octaves, but then I'm going to continue up to the top F and then come all the way back down both octaves and go down to the bottom B. Okay, so here we go with a C major scale, full range. And what that does, that forces us to play our palm keys on every single scale, and it gets us down to that bottom B or B flat, depending on the scale, on every single scale. So what that's going to do, that's going to build up your confidence in playing the top and the bottom of the instrument. So next up, we're going to look at building an arpeggio figure on every single note of that C major scale. So we're going to build an arpeggio on the C, then on the D, then on the E, then on the F, and so on all the way up the scale. But again, we're just keeping this in the key of C major. And I'll just do this over 1 octave and just going up, but you can do this exercise over 2 octaves and you can do it going up and coming down. Another way that we can play our scales is playing it in thirds all the way up over 2 octaves, and in this instance you do end up playing every single note of the scale, just it's slightly displaced. So you play some notes in the bottom octave, some notes in the top octave. One thing that I do want to mention here is that I am playing this obviously on a tenor saxophone, so this is a concert pitch B flat scale, just in case you're trying to play along with this. So next up is shifting that C major scale and starting it on different degrees of the scale. Now, one of the most important things about this is it brings in the concept of modes, or more importantly, it's a link between our major scales and some of the more common jazz scales. And we're just going to pull a couple of those out now and play them through. So we're going to start our C major scale to start with on a D. So this is starting on the 2nd degree of the scale, also known as the Dorian mode. So next up, we're going to look at the C major scale, but starting it on the 5th degree of the scale, which is the G. So this is commonly known as the Mixolydian mode. The final mode that we're going to pull out of this is the one starting on the A. So this is the 6th degree of the scale, and this is the Aeolian mode, or more often known as the natural minor scale. And we're going to come back to this one very shortly when we look at the major and minor link. Let's just see what it sounds like. So I'm going to play a C major scale starting on an A. And again, I'm playing all of these scales at the moment just over 1 octave. You can stretch these out over 2 octaves if your instrument allows, or even stretch them over to the full range of the instrument. So next up, we're going to take a very quick look at different articulations that you can play your scales over. Again, I'm going to be using the C major on my tenor sax as an example, and I'm going to be playing all of these just over 1 octave. Again, I would recommend that you play them over either 2 octaves or stretch that to the full range of the instrument once you're ready. So to start with, we play our C major scale just tongued. Another way that we might play it is all slurred. Another one, we'll bring the tongue back, but we're going to make it staccato. So next we're going to look at mixing those two articulations together. This is a really important one for jazz articulation, and it's the offbeat tonguing. Next up, we're going to keep that mix of articulations, so some slurred, some tongued. We're going to slur the first two, tongue the next two, and continue that pattern along. And we could swap that round, so we could tongue the first two and slur the next two, continuing the pattern. And the final one, maybe for some more advanced students, is the slap tongue. It's very important to practice your slap tongue throughout the full range of the instrument. I'm going to be playing a C major scale here. So there are just a few ways that we can bring in articulation to our scales practice. That's not all of the different ways that we can practice our articulation. We can mix it in any way that we want. I would recommend that you try and create your own little exercises with that, bringing in different combinations of slurred and tongued. Again, increasing the range of that, full range, 2 octaves, depending on what you're comfortable with. But it's really important that you bring in some of that articulation when you're practicing your scales. So next up is the use of a metronome. Now this is probably one of the most important tools that you can use in any practice session. And I'm going to give you a few different ways that you can use a metronome while you're practicing your scales. So this is using a metronome at 80 beats per minute. And to start with, I'm going to play it as crotchets. Next up, I'm going to move that to quavers, so keeping the same C major scale over 1 octave and just playing it in quavers. Next up, we're going to play that C major scale in semiquavers, again at crotchet equals 80 beats per minute. And again, I'm playing all of these scales just over 1 octave. I would recommend that you increase this over 2 octaves or full range, depending on how confident you are with each scale. This is C major scale, 1 octave in triplets. You can see how we're building this up now. So we've talked about range of the scale, so we can play all of these rhythms, all of these different rhythms and speeds over 2 octaves. We could do it over full range. We could even start to bring in some of that articulation that we've just spoken about earlier and bring that in using a metronome at these different rhythms as well. Next is shift the feel of that 80 beats per minute. Instead of the click happening on every beat of the bar, the click is only going to happen on beats 2 and 4. Let me give you an example of that. So I set my metronome going at 80. Previously, in the last few examples, we've heard this. 1, 2, 3, 4. This time what we're going to do is shift that click onto just beats 2 and 4. So this is doubling the speed. So our crotchet beat now turns into 160 beats per minute, but we feel that click only on beats 2 and 4. So the click turns into 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now something that you can do to get you used to this to start with is just use crotchets. So the next example you'll see uses that click on beats 2 and 4, but I'm just playing that C major scale again over 1 octave, and I'm just playing it in crotchets. Let me give you the example. The next thing that you would do once you feel comfortable feeling that beats 2 and 4 is shift that onto quavers. So this is obviously going to be a little bit quicker, but again we're just going to hear that click on beats 2 and 4. Now the next thing is moving this crotchet 80 into an irregular time signature. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to play our C major scale in a slightly different pattern. So this is extended a little bit further than just playing the scale up and down. I'm going to play 5 notes up, 4 notes down. That turns into a pattern that would fit quite nicely over a 7/8 time signature. But I don't want to move my metronome. My metronome is still going to stick to 80 beats per minute. It's not going to take into account that lost quaver of every bar. So as you can see, I've kept the arrows on this exercise as well. But in every other bar, the click turns into an offbeat click. So you can see in that first 7/8 bar, we've got the click on the first group of 2, the second group of 2, and the first group of 3. And then it skips onto the offbeat for the next bar, moving back onto the onbeat on the third bar. What I'm also going to do is bring in some articulation on this, just so you can hear the 7/8 pattern a little bit more clearly. So I'm going to tongue the first of each group. So it's going to be a 2, 2, and a 3 pattern, but with the click staying at 80 beats per minute, as in the crotchet beat. So there are a couple of different ways that we can use a metronome just on one speed to practice our scales. I would suggest that you shift that speed around quite a lot. If you're struggling to do a certain exercise at a certain speed, the only thing that you should do is just slow it down. Do not be afraid of playing your scales super slow to start with. If your fingers can't play the scales slowly, you're never going to be able to play it fast, certainly evenly. And that's what the metronome really does highlight when you're practicing. So up until now, all of the things that I've been speaking about apply to a single scale. So ways that you can get to know that one scale a little bit better on your instrument. Next up is how we sit down in a practice session and we put a number of scales together. So the most common way that people would practice scales, I would think, is chromatically. So starting off on, say, I'll use the example again as a C major scale. I'll start off on a C major scale and I'll move up chromatically to D flat major, D major, and so on, a little bit like this. So what I'm going to suggest now is one tool that we can use that's really going to mix up the way that we play through our major scales, and that is the circle of fifths. So let's take a very quick look at how this circle of fifths is actually built up. If we start at the top with our C major scale and we continue in a clockwise fashion in perfect fifths, we fill in all of our major scales on the outer circle, and our corresponding minor scales are then filled in on the inner circle. Taking a look at how the sharps and flats are built up around the circle of fifths, we can start at the top with our C major scale with no sharps or flats. The clockwise direction around the circle is our sharp side, so if we start with G major with an F sharp, we continue with D major with an F sharp and a C sharp, we keep that going until we get down to our F sharp major scale. The flat side of the circle is the anti-clockwise way around, so we start with F major, which has a B flat major, B flat and E flat, and the flats continue to be added until we get down to the G flat major at the bottom. So just the look of this circle of fifths does give us a different way of playing through our scales. We could add sharps one at a time, or we could add flats one at a time. Another way that we could look at this circle of fifths is if we highlight every other scale. What this does is gives us a whole tone path. So instead of us playing through our scales chromatically or through the circle of fifths, we could play it in a whole tone pattern. The additional scales to fill in on the outside circle then give us a second whole tone path to play our scales. The third and final way that we're going to look at this circle of fifths is just highlighting the top 3 scales, but we're not going to look at these as F major, C major and G major now. We're just going to highlight the F major scale, and the C is then going to be the starting note of that F major scale. which is then the Mixolydian. And the third and final scale is the Dorian mode of F major. So we're going to play our F major scale starting on the G. And what this highlights is a really important chord progression in jazz, which is the 2-5-1. And what you can do is you can shift those three highlighted scales around and practice this 2-5-1 chord progression, or the scales associated with the 2-5-1 chord progression, in any key. So that was just moving into a little bit more depth about how we can shift around that circle of fifths. What I've spoken about there is not all that you can do with the circle of fifths. I would suggest that you spend a little bit of time looking for other patterns that might come up. So the final thing that we're going to look at in today's video is the major and minor link, specifically looking at the pentatonic scale. So let's just take a quick look at how the pentatonic scale is built on both major and minor. So to start with, we will go back to the circle of fifths and we will highlight the C major and A minor scales. So we're going to start by looking at the C major scale and which notes of that C major scale are used to make up the major pentatonic. And they are the first, the second, the third, the fifth and the sixth. We are using our natural minor scale, which is just the same key signature as C major. And the notes that are used to build our minor pentatonic are the first, the third, the fourth, the fifth and the seventh of that natural minor scale. Now really interestingly here you can see that the C major pentatonic is exactly the same notes as the A minor pentatonic. So that's quite a theory-based way to look at our major and minor link. What I'll do now, I'll give you a short practical example. So what I'll do, I'll play my C major scale immediately followed by my A minor scale, and then I'll continue that pattern around the circle of fifths. G major. D major. A major. And F major. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you found at least some of this useful. I know there were some quite basic things included in this video, but I think all of it is very, very important when it comes to practicing your scales. It's a good idea to mix them up, to play them in a lot of different ways, and hopefully it's given you a few ways that you might be able to develop your own little practice session. So bringing in the different aspects of articulation, the way that you can use the circle of fifths, just to mix it up a little bit and you get to know your scales a little bit better.